Alright guys, so I have breaking updates for you today. It concerns the Middle East crisis, which is getting from bad to worse. Russia has also officially won Finland over their defense pact with the United States. So the situation in Europe is heating up as well. There's a multitude of big geopolitical moves that we must cover, because the world as we know it will never be the same again. So let's talk about the Red Sea crisis first. The global supply chain is starting to break down. Shipping companies are terrified to send their vessels through the sea. But the escalation isn't over yet. The longer a ceasefire eludes the Middle East, there'll be more problems erupting. And this time, we have a very deadly threat from the Houthis. They warn the maritime coalition that the Red Sea will be their graveyard. Now, this is very alarming and very disturbing at the same time. We could be on the brink of a crazy escalation where warships could get hit and then they retaliate with hellfire. It's a very deadly threat. We have the capabilities to sink your fleet, your submarines, your warships. This is a response to America scrambling a coalition to police the Red Sea after the Houthi attacks. This is quite a big coalition force consisting of warships from 10 countries. This is mainly the G7 countries like the UK, Italy, Canada, and France, all being led by the US. And we need to realize that just because the coalition ships are in the region, that doesn't make the Red Sea less dangerous. In fact, it could be more dangerous because coalition ships are floating targets to the Houthis. Any ships that sails through the Yemen Strait into the Red Sea might just be collateral damage. Look at how freaked out the global supply chain has become. There looks to be only one container ship in the Red Sea. 67 have diverted away and a further 75 are delayed. This is essentially a shutdown of the entire Red Sea plus the Suez Canal up north. Ships have to now swing across Africa, which will add weeks to the entire voyage, and that will break down supply chains. So if you think the inflation fight is over, the Houthis might have already started round 2. If ships are forced to add thousands of miles to their journey, the cost of transporting anything is definitely going to head up. The moment you shut down the Red Sea, you also take down the entire Suez Canal as well. And let's quantify how significant this disruption can be for global trade and why prices of literally everything will be flying up the longer this drags on. 12% of global trade passes through the Suez. This will affect 30% of global container traffic and over $1 trillion worth of goods per annum. So your Amazon purchases and Christmas presents might cost more and they could arrive next year in 2024. Here's where things get really serious. 80 million tons of grain transit through the Suez as well. This means the food supply chain will get stretched thin and prices will rise. You can live without buying stuff, you can even survive for a while without fuel, but everyone needs to eat. This shutdown could easily morph into a food crisis, especially for the emerging market economies. If the Houthis carry out their threat and start sinking coalition ships, then the entire trading route will be closed down for weeks or even months at end. And shipping companies around the world are starting to rethink their strategy. Red Sea chaos has shippers bracing for weeks without key trade route. Voyages around Africa will add $1 million in shipping costs. Tanker owners also want to see convoys escorting their ships before they use the Red Sea. It's like back to World War II where the Navy they all had to escort the merchant vessels in case of German U-boat attacks. That's how crazy the entire situation is today. However, the Red Sea route cannot be underestimated because of all the oil sanctions on Russia. A lot of the volumes have been rerouted to the Red Sea. The increase is a crazy 140%. Because of this disruption, shipments have to be rerouted elsewhere and that will wreak havoc. There will be more delays and shipments will get more expensive as well. Before the Ukraine conflict, only 2.7 million barrels of oil flowed through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, but that volume has grown to 6.5 million barrels today. That's a very big jump. This affects oil from both the Middle East and Russian crude as well, so disruptions could happen. So where will the oil be rerouted to? For the Middle East crude, there's no choice but to go around South Africa to reach the Western markets, so volumes to Europe will be delayed and compromised. But for Russia, it's less of a problem. And this is where we need to talk about the one advantage Moscow has over the West, which is the North Sea route. Remember that Russia sells the majority of their oil to Asia. Volumes to Europe used to make up around 50% of Russian exports, but that was 24 months ago. Today, it is a completely different story. Almost 90% of Russia oil flows to Asia now. It's heading to countries like China and India, and unlike the West, Russia is in full control of the Arctic trading route. Over the last 20 years, they have been focusing a lot on the Arctic region. They have been pumping out gas and setting up tons of colonies to populate the area, right? Russian icebreakers have been sent to the region as well to clear the route, making it passable for vessels. Since the start of 2023, Arctic crude flows to China have been increasing as well, hitting over 10 million barrels in the October summer month. As global warming picks up, we can expect this trading route to open up as well. Russia can send more volumes to Asia, bypassing the route through the Middle East. If we look at the Northern Sea route, it's apparent how much more efficient it is versus going through the Suez. Transporting oil from Europe to the Far East will take almost 21,000 kilometers. However, using the Northeast Passage, you'll take only 14,000. That's almost 30% of voyage time saved. So fuel costs will be lower and getting to your customers will be faster. It's important we bookmark this for future reference. As the Northeast Passage becomes more viable, energy supply between Russia, China, and Asia will be secured. In contrast, supply chains in the West, especially Europe, will be in constant danger of breaking apart. But let's shift attention to Finland because we might have a big disaster brewing in the region. Finland has officially signed a defense accord with the United States. According to the deal, this will grant the US military broad access across Finland, especially along the border next to Russia. I think we can see why Putin is furious about that. Russia's reason for the Ukraine conflict was all about NATO expansion eastwards. They don't want any Western army alongside their borders. That is their viewpoint that the West needs to consider. Remember that Finland became a NATO member on 4th April 2023, this year. The addition of Finland now doubles NATO's pre-existing border with Russia, and this is a big development that we must pay attention to. Let's take a closer look at Finland's agreement with the United States. Understanding the facts here is extremely important because it can hint at a disaster to come. According to Reuters, the agreement centers around giving the US swift military access and aid to Finland in case of a conflict. As such, the US military will have full access to 15 facilities and areas in the country. They can store military equipment and ammunition there as well. These areas also include 4 air bases, a military port, and railway access to northern Finland. So in theory, NATO could set up shop directly next to Russia, which I assume is unthinkable to Moscow. I think this should really freak us out, right? This is an extreme tail risk that could plunge more of Europe into chaos, and the diplomatic fallout is already happening. Russia has called on the Finland ambassador to essentially scold him. Moscow said they would take the necessary measures to counter the aggressive decisions of Finland and their NATO allies. Now, what those measures are, we have no idea yet, but it's not impossible that the conflict could spread. And I want us to listen very carefully to what Putin said in the interview regarding the situation. We are going to see even more military buildups along Russia's borders, and this time, it might be next to Finland. Here's what he said. The US dragged Finland into NATO. We enjoyed the most kind, cordial relations, including economic relations. There were no problems, and now there will be, because we will create the Leningrad military district and deploy certain military units there. So in no uncertain terms, things will be heating up between Russia and Finland. There's already a border shutdown happening between the two countries, so the flow of people to and fro will be hindered. If things explode into a conflict, we'll see more chaos in Europe where everything starts breaking down again. Inflation will be back, and you can bet any remaining energy flows to Europe might be cut off. There's already a sense of dread in the West that should Russia win and occupy Ukraine, they might establish new military bases west of the country. Now, this map is from the Institute for the Study of War, which is an American think tank. It outlines a nightmare scenario for the West should Ukraine completely fall to Russia. Now, those red dots are Russian bases while the blue dots are NATO bases. And the red circles highlight the extent of Russia's air defense, which overlaps well into NATO territory, especially Poland. Now, all these are just hypotheticals, but they show you the extent the West is wargaming this out. And this ironically pushes things more towards a conflict instead of de-escalation. Now, shifting focus back to the economic war, things are breaking down there as well. And once again, this all revolves around oil. I think today almost everything that affects global trade can be weaponized, right? Whether that is the reserve currency, the US dollar, oil production, or even trading routes, nothing is truly off the table now. The West is moving to enforce oil sanctions on Russia by targeting shipping companies. They are pushing shippers to disclose more information about their Russian oil dealings. The price cap restricts companies from buying oil above the $60 price cap. As the price of euros rebounds above $60, the G7, they want to make sure Russian revenues stay down. But there's a fundamental problem with this. Over 70% of Russian crude today is being transported by a shadow fleet. These are vessels that aren't owned by the G7 countries nor involved with the EU as well. They don't rely on Western insurance to ship cargoes, so they are technically out of reach for the West. Many of them are Chinese ships, and we know that China won't be enforcing sanctions on Russia as well. In response to the enforcement, Putin he's hitting back. He just extended the measures against the price cap until the end of June 2024. Any Russian company will be banned from obeying the price cap. This effectively forces Russian companies to do two things. Either they bypass Western shipping companies to avoid the sanctions, or they simply restrict supplies to the global market. Both of these outcomes mean upwards pressure on the price of crude. It's a form of internal restriction on their own oil exports, and Russia isn't afraid of imposing them. The big problem isn't really about Russian volumes coming down, that isn't the issue. Before the conflict, Russian volumes were around 3 million barrels a day. 24 months later, it's still at the same level. In fact, you could actually argue volumes have gone up. The issue for us is how long this oil war will last. I'm sure no one here is enjoying this endless inflation hell we are trapped in. Because Russian crude is flowing exclusively to Asia, the West will continue enduring a higher baseline of energy prices. Here's a reminder of how important Russian oil still is to Europe. Despite all the sanctions, they still can't decouple away. Because of an exemption, Bulgaria is still importing tons of crude oil from Russia to prevent shortages. And when they asked the EU if they could buy above the price cap, the answer was very surprising. Brussels confirmed that the exemptions allowed crude oil to be imported above the $60 level. Bulgaria doesn't have to follow the price cap. So this is yet another example of double standards in the EU. The world at large has to buy oil below the price cap or face consequences. But if there's an emergency, the EU countries could get a free pass indeed. Now, you would think all this can get resolved once the war is over, right? When the dust settles, they will iron out an agreement and sanctions would eventually be lifted. Unfortunately, it's not looking good here as well. This might be the new normal for everyone. The US wants to halve Russia's oil and gas revenues by 2030, and their justification is all about containing Russia well into the next decade. Western sanctions are going to continue for years to come. It might not even end after a peace treaty is signed. This limbo could continue indefinitely. Listen to the statement. The goal of these sanctions is to change Russia's behavior. Even after peace is achieved, they want to prevent Moscow from rearming and preparing for stage 3. This is bizarre because it assumes a third conflict between Russia and Ukraine again after this one. So if you think things will return to normal, it's time to readjust your expectations. Eventually, the dust will settle. The Israel conflict will stop and Russia-Ukraine will end as well. But the problem of persistent inflation is not going to end. And this is where we need to tie things together with the economy. We know next year that the Federal Reserve is going to cut interest rates. 3 rate cuts are coming in 2024, they have signaled that. However, let's focus on the longer term interest rates. We are not going back to 0% unless the whole economy collapses. The Federal Reserve has pegged long term rates at 2.5 to 3%, and this could last well into 2030. They know that inflation is still going to be a big problem because of all the decoupling, oil sanctions, and supply chain risks. Higher prices are here to stay, so there is a limit to how much they can drop rates as well. So the explosive growth of the last decade, well, that's not going to happen. The longer this economic war continues, the more money will be borrowed at higher interest rates as well. And once we understand this, it's pretty obvious, it's pretty simple to understand what the end game is all about. The last scene of this movie will be a debt crisis exploding. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will the Red Sea crisis escalate even further? And how will Russia respond to the Finland-US defense deal? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.